in a quiet wooden house by the sea, in Carmel by the sea. The evening light slides gently across the dark oak floors, touching the face of a man who has seen nearly a century of cinema. Clint Eastwood, 95 years old. The last sentinel of Hollywood's golden age sits by the window, a cup of black coffee trembling faintly in his hand. His voice, gravelly yet firm, breaks the silence when the Variety journalist asks about Robert Redford, his friend, his rival, his mirror image in another world of fame and solitude. Eastwood gives a small, almost wistful smile. Robert wasn't just an actor, he says softly. He was the last man who still believed that decency belonged in this town. And for the first time, the man who had built his career on silence begins to speak. He talks about Redford not as a legend, but as a man of contradictions, brilliant yet lonely, admired yet misunderstood. He recalls the secret rivalry that once divided them, the unspoken loyalty that survived decades, and the quiet truth about Redford's death that shook him to his core. "I remember," Clint murmurs, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon. "We once fought over a role. Then we stopped talking for years. But in the end, there was no winner between us, just two men trying to protect what was left of their dignity." The room falls still. Even the recorder on the table seems to hesitate before capturing his next words. Because this isn't just an interview, it's a confession, a farewell, and perhaps a love letter to a vanished era. Why now, after a lifetime of silence? Has Clint Eastwood chosen to reveal these truths? And could the stories he's finally telling be the deepest wounds Robert Redford carried to his grave? Hollywood once called them two sides of the same coin. One embodied strength and grit, the other, grace and golden light. Together, they defined what it meant to be a man on screen and off it. They paid the price for that illusion. Behind the applause and the silver flashes of the red carpet lay years of rivalry, compassion, and pain. And somewhere between them, in that fragile space where art meets life, lived a story that Hollywood never dared to tell. That story begins here, with the two men who shaped an era, and with the moment when Clint Eastwood, at 95, finally decides to open the door he kept closed for decades. Hollywood, 1973. A single film changed everything. The way we were premiered in packed theaters from Los Angeles to New York. And within a week, it became not just a movie, but a cultural phenomenon. People didn't go to see a story, they went to feel something real. They were the kind of couple that didn't need words. Clint Eastwood recalled in his Variety interview, his voice lowering to a reflective murmur. When Redford looked at Barbara, the whole set believed it. At that time, Robert Redford was untouchable, the embodiment of American perfection after Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Barbra Streisand was the reigning queen of both cinema and song, her voice carrying the ache of an entire generation. Together, they were fire and water, Redford's quiet masculinity melting into Streisand's electric sensitivity. A production assistant once said, when they were in the same room, even silence had a pulse. Sidney Pollack, the director, later told NBC, "There was one take I'll never forget." Barbara rested her head on his shoulder. And for a moment, no one dared to breathe. Not even me. But behind the magic of those scenes, tension simmered. Redford was meticulous. He dissected scripts, questioned motives, demanded rewrites if a single line betrayed emotional honesty. Streisand, vibrant and intuitive, believed in spontaneity. When they clashed, sparks flew quietly, like static between two souls who could not meet halfway. During one shoot, Redford refused to say the line, "It'll be better this time." He told Pollack that man's already broken. He doesn't believe in better anymore. Pollock rewrote the scene without dialogue. Just a look. Just silence. And that silence would go on to make millions cry a kind of cinematic poetry that no words could ever match. Off camera, their chemistry was no less haunting. Redford was distant. Disciplined, he left the set the moment the director said cut, avoided the lunch breaks, the chatter, the noise. Streisand, always luminous, filled the air with laughter, humming softly between takes. Then came the rumor. According to the Los Angeles Times, Redford's wife, Lola Van Wagenen, had once appeared unexpectedly on set. No one ever confirmed it. But for days, Barbara fell silent, her eyes searching for something that perhaps had already vanished. When filming ended, she refused to change out of costume. A crew member remembered her saying quietly, "I am afraid I'll never see Robert like this again." At the Los Angeles premiere months later, Redford sat 3 rows behind her. When the lights came up, he approached, leaned close, and whispered, "Thank you for believing in us." Then, just like in the movies, he walked away, no backward glance, no second take. Years later, in her memoir, My Name is Barbara, Streisand revealed a phone call that came one December night in 1974. She picked up, and before she could speak, she heard his voice soft, certain, trembling just slightly. "I love you," Redford said, "and I always will." Then he hung up. For a long time, she just sat there not knowing whether to cry or smile. The memoir set Hollywood on fire. People wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it. That maybe, behind all the scripts and camera lights, 2 of its brightest stars had touched something pure. Clint Eastwood paused during his interview, his eyes half-lidded with memory. "I met them in Malibu that year," he said. You could see it, that quiet pull between them. They carried that feeling for the rest of their lives, but neither dared to touch it again. That love, born in fiction, survived in silence. It became the ghost that followed Redford for decades, proof that even in a world built on illusions, sometimes the most unreal love is the truest of all. And yet, as Clint went on to reveal, it was right after The Way We Were that Robert Redford's life took a darker turn, one that had nothing to do with fame, and everything to do with how Hollywood devours its own. By the late 1960 seconds, Robert Redford had become the face of American masculinity, sunlit hair, piercing blue eyes, a calm voice that could silence a room. But the brighter the light, the darker the shadow behind it. And Hollywood, hungry for whispers, began to look for the cracks. Clint Eastwood, still in his deliberate, low voice, recalled, "In this town, beauty is never free. The more perfect you look, the more people want to find the dirt underneath." The rumors began innocently, a line in Variety praising Redford for Inside Daisy Clover, 1965. He introduces a new kind of masculinity, gentle, yet magnetic. A compliment, meant as praise. Yet within a week, the Hollywood Citizen News ran a provocative headline. Robert Redford, a role too real to be acting? That single insinuation lit the fuse. Suddenly, tabloids hunted him like prey. National Enquirer hinted at a double life behind the perfect smile. Hollywood Tonight quoted an anonymous stylist who described him as too meticulous, too refined, a man who seems to arrange the whole world before stepping outside. Intended as admiration, it became accusation. In a decade when ambiguity was dangerous, Redford's quiet dignity was misread as secrecy. Then came the photograph. Summer 1968. Beverly Hills. a charity event for the American Film Institute. Redford, smiling, his hand resting casually on the shoulder of screenwriter Larry Kramer, who would later become a trailblazer for LGBTQ rights. The next morning, Los Angeles Herald-Examiner splashed it across the front page. Robert Redford and his mysterious friends. The caption did not need to say more. Hollywood read between the lines, and the phones at Warner Brothers rang non-stop. The studio rushed to release a statement. It was a charity dinner. Nothing more. But once the story left the newsroom, no one could pull it back. Then came the most explosive claim of all Confidential Weekly. 1,970. Redford and Tab Hunter, the secret behind Paramount's closed doors. The article described a supposed months-long affair during filming. Though it offered no proof, the industry split into two camps, those who dismissed it as a smear, and those who insisted Hollywood was hiding something. Through it all, Redford said nothing. Not a single word. Clint Eastwood remembered he didn't deny it, didn't defend himself, just stayed quiet. And in Hollywood, silence is more dangerous than guilt. It gives people room to imagine anything. The whispers grew into a storm. Every time Redford appeared with a male colleague, a director, a photographer, a friend, gossip columns lit up. The late-night shows cracked jokes about his enigmatic charm. The noise became unbearable. In 1971, Vanity Fair wrote, "Redford has become the one man Hollywood cannot read." Soon after, he stopped trying to explain. He withdrew from Los Angeles, bought land in Utah, and began building something of his own, a retreat, a refuge, a small film center that would later become the Sundance Institute. He didn't leave Hollywood because he was tired of fame. Eastwood said, he left because he was tired of lies. But the lies followed him anyway. In March 1978, NBC, Los Angeles broke a story that would shake the industry to its core. Reporter Tommy Wallace stood before the camera, holding a stack of documents. "We have obtained leaked LAPD surveillance files," he said calmly. Among the names listed, Robert Redford. Within minutes, phones rang across the city. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner printed in red, "Is the LAPD spying on Robert Redford?" The document suggested Redford had been secretly monitored for years, accused of hosting ideological gatherings at his Sundance Ranch during the Vietnam War. No proof, no charges, just suspicion. But in the paranoia of the 1,970 seconds, suspicion was enough. Television pundits asked if he was leading an activist cell. The Washington Post hinted at funding anti-war films under false names. Then, a producer who had once worked with Redford claimed he was ready to testify on nothing more than hearsay. That was the breaking point. Redford's lawyers filed a lawsuit against NBC and the producer for invasion of privacy. When he appeared in court, exhausted but composed, he said only one line to the cameras: "I am a filmmaker, not an intelligence target. I want Hollywood to be remembered for its art, not its suspicion." The case was dismissed for lack of evidence, but the damage was irreversible. Endorsements vanished. Projects were canceled. As one critic wrote bitterly, Robert Redford isn't just being watched by Hollywood, he's being abandoned by it. When a Vanity Fair journalist later visited him in Utah, a housekeeper said, "He's been in the woodshop all week, drinking coffee, reading the papers, not saying a word, like someone who learned Hollywood's rules too well and finally stopped playing." Clint Eastwood, remembering that time, sighed deeply. In this town, if you're too honest, they call you weak. Robert was the cleanest man I ever knew. That's why they tried to dirty him, because they couldn't understand decency without irony. Redford never spoke of the scandal again. But from that silence, something new began to grow, a different kind of strength, forged not in fame, but in solitude, before the fame, before the rumors, before Hollywood claimed him. Robert Redford was simply a young man from Colorado with calloused hands and impossible dreams. The year was 1957. He was a struggling art student, working part-time at a bar near the University of Colorado to pay his rent. One evening, as snow drifted past the windows, he met a brown-haired history major named Lola Van Wagenen. She was calm where he was restless, gentle where he was fire. Years later, he told a friend. When she smiled, I thought, this is the kind of light that makes you stop running. They married the following year, on September 12, 1958, in a small chapel in Provo, Utah. No reporters, no gowns of silk, just two young dreamers and a borrowed guitar playing softly in the background. When a local journalist once asked why he married so young, Redford smiled and said, "Because I wanted a place to come home to when all the lights go out." In the 1,960 seconds, as Barefoot in the Park and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid made him a star, Lola stayed behind in Utah, raising their 4 children, Scott, Shauna, David James, and Amy. Hollywood adored him. The world called him the Golden Boy. But every photograph of him smiling on the red carpet cast a shadow over a quiet kitchen hundreds of miles away. Their first child, Scott, died of sudden infant death syndrome only months after birth. Redford never spoke of it publicly. Yet those close to him said the tragedy left a crack that never healed. Journalist Nancy Collins once wrote, on set, whenever Redford saw a child, he would lower his voice, as if afraid his own loss might echo through the room. He poured himself into work. She poured herself into keeping the family alive. The distance widened quietly like 2 rivers running parallel, close enough to hear each other, but never touching again. In a private letter that surfaced decades later, Lola wrote, "Robert always says he loves me, but I think he's in love with the whole world." By the mid-1970 seconds, the distance had become a silence. Redford stopped mentioning his wife in interviews, even though he once called her the light behind the curtain. And after the LAPD scandal in 1978, that silence deepened. The media siege drove him back to Sundance, his refuge in the mountains. But it also forced him to confront the cost of fame, the price paid by the ones who never asked for it. In 1983, Lola spoke softly to the Utah Daily News. "I feel like I'm standing outside the door watching him walk away. He loves his work, but maybe he needs freedom more than a home." 3 years later, in 1985, they divorced. No lawsuits. No battles, just a quiet signing of papers and a farewell. When a reporter asked if he regretted it, Redford answered, "Sometimes the kindest way to love someone is to let them go." He moved into a small wooden cabin in Provo Canyon, surrounded by snow-dusted pines. Friends said that at night he would sit on the porch with a glass of wine, staring at the mountains until dawn. He spoke little about the past. When someone mentioned family, he would smile faintly, then change the subject. Shauna, his eldest, became a painter and art lecturer in Salt Lake City. David James, a documentarian, died in 2020 after a long illness. Amy, the youngest, became a filmmaker. Her 2008 film, The Guitar, premiered at Sundance, as if her father's dream had circled back home. Lola, for her part, earned a PhD in history and founded Clio, Visualizing History, a nonprofit dedicated to women's stories. They had built separate lives. Yet they remained bound by quiet respect, the kind that endures long after love fades. Still, Hollywood refused to let him rest. In the 1,990 seconds, new rumors linked him to actresses he barely knew. Brazilian painter Sonia Braga, Swedish star Lena Olin, both denied it. Redford, unbothered, told CBS simply, "What's precious? I keep silent about. The moment you explain it, it stops being yours." He chose stillness over spectacle, truth over noise. Then, in 2009, the world was surprised again. At 72, Redford appeared at the Cannes Film Festival hand in hand with Sibylle Schagers, a German painter nearly 20 years younger. The cameras exploded in flashes, but this time, he didn't flinch. A month later, in July, they married quietly in a small church by the Elbe River in Hamburg. Only a few close friends attended. One of them was Clint Eastwood. When Variety asked Clint what it was like to see his old friend remarry, he smiled. "Robert spent half his life learning how to let go of loneliness," he said. "When he looks at Sibylle, he doesn't have to play a part anymore." Since then, their days have been slow and tender at the Sundance Ranch. They paint. They plant trees. They host small film screenings for young students. Robert Redford, once the golden face of American cinema, became something rarer, a storyteller of silence, of time, and of grace. And yet, Clint Eastwood's voice deepened as he revealed the next chapter, because even in the peace of Utah's mountains, Redford's story was not finished. There was one final twist, a moment when fate handed him the role of a lifetime, only to take it away. Hollywood, 1993. A small novel had just taken America by storm, The Bridges of Madison County, a tender love story about a photographer and a lonely housewife that made millions of readers weep. Within months, Warner Brothers secured the film rights. And in the first casting meeting, only one name made everyone nod in agreement: Robert Redford. He was the obvious choice, the wandering soul, the romantic ideal, the man who could make silence speak. Redford had just directed A River Runs Through It, 1992, a film that critics hailed as a poem in light. To the studio, it seemed simple. He would both direct and star in Bridges, the way he had done with Ordinary People. He read the script in 3 days. Then he sent screenwriter Richard LaGravenese a handwritten note, 3 pages long, suggesting subtler dialogue and more pauses in the Twilight Bridge scene. He wanted to remove the excess words, to let the wind do the talking. It was perfect, until it wasn't. During a closed-door meeting at Warner Lot 16, producer Kathleen Kennedy made a remark that changed Hollywood history. "Redford is too perfect. He's sunlight over a meadow," she said. "But this character, Robert Kincaid, needs to feel like the wind passing through an empty field. Beautiful, but lost." A single observation, sharp and poetic, sealed his fate. Marketing executives feared audiences wouldn't believe a man like Redford could be lonely. "If he's in the film," one memo read, "viewers will expect a happy ending, and we don't have one." A few weeks later, a new name appeared in the meeting notes: Clint Eastwood. He was 63, rugged, lined, and real, carrying the weight of years in every word. He had just finished In the Line of Fire. When Warner Brothers sent him the script, he read it in one night, at 7 a.m. The next morning, he called the studio himself. "It's a beautiful story," he said. "If you'll let me, I'd like to tell it." Within days, the deal was signed. Robert Redford was out. Clint Eastwood was in. The news swept through Hollywood like wildfire. Entertainment Weekly ran the headline: Redford dropped for being too perfect. The irony was almost cruel. For decades, Redford had been criticized for being too private, too distant, and now, for being too flawless to play heartbreak. When a CBS reporter asked him how he felt, Redford smiled gently. Some roles aren't meant to be kept. He said, I think Clint will tell it better than I could. Publicly, it was a graceful response. Privately, friends said he was devastated. He had seen Bridges as the role of a lifetime, the one that would finally let him be vulnerable, stripped of charm and certainty. But the chance had vanished. For months afterward, he canceled appearances, refused interviews, and retreated once again to Sundance. There, he focused on his festival, on the younger filmmakers who came seeking